What's going on, everybody? It's Dave, No Money. We're back. I wanted to take a few minutes to revisit our Wildcard Power Rankings that I unveiled in episode 13 about a week ago.
Wildcard, bitches! Yeah!
I actually wanted to get to this a couple days ago, but as you know, Strixhaven came out in the meantime, so we've been doing a couple of drafts of those. So this is coming out a little bit after I intended. But I did want to lock in an update of these power rankings before we have our first full week of Secrets of Strixhaven Standard, so that we can better measure the impact of Secrets of Strixhaven on Standard in the subsequent power ranking videos. Now, as I won't be going over the methodology in deep detail like I did in the first Wildcard Power Rankings, I will go over the wave tops to give you a quick refresher on how it is we arrived at these power scores. And for those of you who didn't watch the first episode, I would recommend going back to episode 13, which I'll link in the description. And I'll also go over one update that I had to make to the methodology in light of an outlier deck this week. More on that in a second. So these power rankings are based on the data from 8 MTGO challenges that took place between April 16th and April 22nd, which, as you can tell, does incorporate one day of Secrets of Strixhaven Standard, but it wasn't enough to move the needle. The top 32 decks from each challenge was analyzed, which gives us 256 total decks, in which 408 unique cards were used. And as a reminder, the methodology assigns points for top 8 finishes, for a total of 288 points available across all the challenges. Breaking down the 256 decks, I could identify 28 unique archetypes, which is an increase of 5 from the last Power Rankings video. Most of those, in my analysis, came from the last day of this window, when Secrets of Strixhaven was now standard legal, and primarily involved Golgari innovations. It wasn't enough to move the needle as it was only one day, but it makes me expect that by the next Wildcard Power Rankings video, we're going to see Golgari climb up the deck share. Here on the screen, you can see the top 13 archetypes laid out by what their percentage of the meta share was, and how those archetypes' meta share have increased or decreased over the last week. What probably stands out to you are how the top decks, minus Dimir Excruciator to a small extent, saw a noticeable increase in their meta share. Even though the biggest exception to this was the Izzet Spelementals decks moving down in the meta share, it was more than compensated for by the other Izzet archetypes gaining meta share. So it definitely still is an Izzet-dominated metagame. As for the tweak I had to make to the power score methodology, in order to control for outliers when evaluating archetypes, I found it necessary to evaluate not only an archetype's share of the points across all challenges, the amount of decks that are attributable to that archetype across all challenges, but then also what percentage of the challenges did that archetype appear in with at least one deck. The example here you can see for Monument to Endurance is that it appeared in 2 archetypes, Izzet Lessons and Rakdos Discard, and whereas Izzet Lessons appeared in all 8 challenges, Rakdos Discard only appeared in 3 out of 8 challenges, or 37.5%. I simply took that percentage and added it as a multiplier when determining the archetype's weight, as I went over in episode 13. Doing so helps to dampen the effect of outliers when an archetype that only appears in one challenge with a single deck happens to score some points and throws off the traditional weighting. As you may recall from episode 13 when I went over the methodology, the original archetype weighting was essentially what you see on this graph. Along the x-axis, you have the percentage of the meta share, and on the y-axis, you have the percentage of the points earned across the challenges. In theory, archetypes that appear above the dash red line are archetypes that are overperforming their meta share, what I consider to be a key component in assessing the power of an archetype and therefore the importance of any cards found within it. So as you can see here, Mono Green Landfall gets dinged this week for having such a high share of the metagame because its share of the points across the challenges underperformed what the expectation should be for a deck that has that high of a share of the meta. So even though Mono Green Landfall actually got more points across all the challenges than Dimir Excruciator did, Dimir Excruciator will end up having a higher archetype weight than Mono Green Landfall because that actually overperformed its meta share, whereas Mono Green Landfall underperformed it. But one thing that can skew the data is something like we saw this week with Boros Weapons Manufacturing. Across the 8 challenges and the 256 decks, Boros Weapons Manufacturing as an archetype had a single deck represented in one challenge. In that one challenge though, it ended in 5th place, which was good enough for 4 points on our scale, meaning that with only a 0.4% share of decks, it managed to capture 1.4 share of the points, and by the original calculation of the archetype weight, that greater than 3.0 ratio of point share to meta share, all cards within Boros Weapons Manufacturing suddenly found their way to the top of the metagame. Now this might be deserved, but I figured that any archetype should have to prove itself across multiple challenges in order to get the full weighting of that ratio. And that's the reason for the update. Again, for a fuller explanation of how the rest of the calculation works, please go back to episode 13 if you haven't watched it already. All right, with that out of the way, on to the rankings for this week. Like last time, we'll start with the top 10 rares and mythics. New addition to the list this week is Momo Friendly Flyer at 10. The Momo deck saw increased success this week, and being the namesake of the archetype, Momo Friendly Flyer is a must-have 4 of, and that propels it into the top 10. And boosted by another strong week of Is It Prowess, Slickshot Show Off comes in at 9. At 8 is Enduring Curiosity, as Dimir Midrange for the second week in a row has the highest archetype weighting amongst all archetypes. So again, Dimir Midrange is here to stay. One of the biggest overperformers this week was Temur Elementals, which is what led to Ashling Rekindled, Vibrance, and Wistfulness taking the next 3 spots respectively. Followed by Voice of Victory, already a staple in the Boros archetypes, saw an extra boost thanks to the mono-white Momo deck. At number 3, and up 5 spots from last week, is Kaito Bane of Nightmares. Then at number 2, a card that barely missed the top 10 last week, but thanks to Is It Prowess, has shot up the rankings, it's Storm Chaser's Talent. And coming in at number 1 this week amongst all rares and mythics, because it just so perfectly fits into numerous different archetypes, is Deceit. Now just like last week, I'll ask you to guess how many of these rares and mythics made the top 10 of all non-land cards. For the second week in a row, the answer is 2. But kicking us off at 10, and thanks to the increased success of white decks this week, is Seam Rip, followed by Abandoned Attachments at 9, our number 2 rare and mythic Storm Chaser's Talent coming in at 8, Dimir Excruciator favorite Bitter Triumph at 7, Dimir Midrange staple and all-around annoying card Flood Pit's Drowner is at 6, Boomerang Basics at 5, our number 1 rare and mythic Deceit at 4. Last week's number 2 drops a spot to number 3, and that's Stock Up. Moving up 6 spots from the number 8 to the number 2 is Requiting Hex, and retaining its place at the top of all non-land cards at number 1 is Burst Lightning. Similar theme to last week with these non-land cards, Standard is fast. With the exception of Stock Up at 3 mana, all of these cards could be cast for 2 mana, interact with the opponent somehow, and 4 of these represent their color's best 1 mana interaction with Seam Rip, Boomerang Basics, Requiting Hex, and Burst Lightning. And also similar to last week, when we expand the aperture to all cards except for basic lands, the special lands are what dominates the rankings. This week, only 3 of the top 10 non-land cards make the overall top 10, starting with Stock Up at 10, our first non-basic land and new to the top 10 this week, Starting Town. Then also new to the top 10 this week, 2 blue-black lands in Gloom Lake Verge and Watery Grave, followed by Requiting Hex, then 2 of the blue-red lands that took up the top 3 last week in Riverpire Verge and Spire Bluff Canal. Then our number 1 overall non-land card, Burst Lightning, and then at number 2, Multiversal Passage, and retaining its number 1 spot from last week, it's Steam Vents. For top 10 sideboards, not too much has changed from last week. A couple in, couple out, but most of it's just rearranging within the top 10. New addition, Oil Deep Gear Hulk, followed by blue-red cards that you would expect to see dominate these rankings in an Is It dominated meta. But this time, instead of Graveyard Hate taking just the number 1 overall spot in the Sideboard Power Rankings, it takes the top 2 overall spots, with Rest in Peace at number 2, and maintaining its number 1 sideboard piece in the metagame right now, Soul Guide Lantern. That does it for the Wildcard Power Rankings update this week. Please stay tuned for next week, where we'll have 1 week of Seekers of Strixhaven Standard under our belts, so we can all learn together just how much more dominant Is It has gotten thanks to Strixhaven. Appreciate you joining on this one, everybody. We'll see you in the next one.